In 1960, German archaeologists working in the ancient temple precinct of Uruk unearthed a clay tablet that would raise questions about something the Sumerians never explicitly called a bloodline, but documented with the precision of a genealogical record. The tablet bore the excavation number W.20307. It measured roughly 15 centimetres across. Its surface was covered in cuneiform script arranged in 2 parallel columns. On the left side, a list of antediluvian kings. On the right side, names that appeared nowhere in the standard king lists. These were the Apkallu, the sages, and each king had one. The tablet is cool to the touch in the Baghdad Museum's climate-controlled storage. The clay is a pale ochre, fired hard in antiquity, compressed by millennia of soil weight into a density that feels almost like stone. When light catches the wedge-shaped impressions at the correct angle, the cuneiform signs throw tiny shadows, making the ancient text momentarily three-dimensional, as if the scribe's reed stylus had just lifted from the surface. This is not mythology arranged as poetry. This is a list, systematic, deliberate, king then sage, as if documenting an institutional arrangement that predated the flood itself. The Uruk list, as scholars now call it, does something unprecedented among Mesopotamian texts. It pairs rulers with their advisors across the boundary that should have erased everything, the Great Flood. The left column names kings whose reigns stretched across thousands of years, beings who ruled when the world was young and the gods still walked among their temples. The right column names the Apkallu who stood beside them, 7 sages before the waters rose, 4 more after, each described with a phrase that appears again and again in the ritual texts of human descent. The text was published in 1962 by Jan van Dijk. His edition appeared in the archaeological journal Vorläufiger Bericht von dem Deutschen Archäologischen Institut und der Deutschen Orientgesellschaft aus mit der Deutschen Forschungsgemeinschaft unternommenen Ausgrabungen in Uruk-Waka. The tablet dates to 165-164 BC, composed during the Seleucid period, when Mesopotamian scribes were still copying texts in cuneiform, even as the Greek alphabet spread across the region. But the information it preserves is far older. The tablet is a copy of a copy of a copy, reaching back through the centuries to records that claim to document a time before the world was destroyed. This particular arrangement of information, this pairing of kings with sages, suggests something that the mainstream interpretation of Mesopotamian mythology tends to overlook. These were not symbolic figures illustrating moral lessons. The text presents them as a roster, a bureaucratic record of who advised whom, the institutional memory of a civilization that organized itself around the transmission of knowledge from beings who possessed it to rulers who required it. The Apkallu appear in other texts. They are invoked in rituals. They are depicted on palace walls. They are credited with authoring the foundational texts of divination, medicine, and astronomy. But the Uruk list does something different. It establishes relationships. It creates a structure. It implies that the sages were not wandering teachers dispensing wisdom to whoever would listen, but rather figures attached to specific centres of power, their knowledge channeled through particular lineages of kingship. Before we go further, a request. If you're listening to this in the quiet hours, settling into rest, perhaps you could leave a comment about where you are in the world right now. There's something profound about knowing that this investigation into ancient transmission of knowledge is itself being transmitted across the planet, reaching you wherever you are, in whatever time zone the night has found you. The Sumerians believed knowledge moved through specific channels, specific people. Tonight it moves through sound, through language, through the strange intimacy of a voice in the darkness speaking about those who came before the flood. The question the Uruk list raises is deceptively simple. If the Apkallu were merely mythological symbols, why document them with the same administrative precision used for recording grain taxes and temple inventories? Why pair them systematically with rulers as if they held official positions? The text suggests an answer that scholarship has been reluctant to fully articulate. What if the Sumerians were not creating mythology, but preserving records? What if the bloodline revealed in these texts is not metaphor, but documentation of an actual system through which primordial knowledge was transmitted across the greatest catastrophe their world had ever known? The tablet W2003-7 sits in its archival box in Baghdad. The information it contains has been translated, published, and analysed. But the implications of that information, the suggestion that ancient Mesopotamia possessed an institutional framework for preserving pre-flood knowledge through specific lineages, remains a question that opens more than it closes. When kingship descended from heaven, the Sumerian king list begins with a phrase that has puzzled translators since the text was first deciphered. Nam lugal antedid abba, when kingship was lowered from heaven, not established, not invented, not evolved, lowered, as if it were a physical object passed from one realm to another. The king list survives in multiple copies, the most complete being the Weld Blundell prism, a clay prism inscribed around 2170 BC, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The text opens with those words, then names the first city to receive this descended authority, Eridu. Eridu occupied a unique position in Sumerian consciousness. Archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Shirain have confirmed continuous occupation stretching back to the Ubaid period, roughly 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in southern Mesopotamia. But the Sumerians remembered Eridu as more than merely old. They remembered it as first, the earliest city, the place where civilization began, not because humans gradually developed urban life, but because something was brought there. The Abzu temple in Eridu was dedicated to Enki, the god associated with the subterranean waters of the Abzu, with wisdom, with crafts, with the technical knowledge that separated civilization from subsistence. The king list preserves the names of 8 kings who ruled from Eridu before the flood. The first was Alulim, whose reign lasted 28,800 years. The second was Alaugar, who ruled for 36,000 years. These are not numbers that invite literal interpretation by modern standards, but neither are they random. They follow patterns, multiples of the Sumerian sexagesimal system, suggesting that whoever compiled this list was working from a tradition that measured time differently, or understood duration through mathematics that encoded information beyond simple chronology. After Eridu, kingship moved to Bad Tabira, then to Larak, to Sippar, and finally to Shuruppak. 5 cities. 8 kings in some versions, 10 in others. Reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. Then the text states, matter-of-factly, the flood swept over. After that single line documenting catastrophe, the list resumes, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. 2 things are worth noting about this structure. First, kingship must descend from heaven twice, once before the flood, once after, as if the flood had broken something fundamental, requiring the divine order to be re-established. Second, the post-flood dynasties begin with reign lengths that are still impossibly long by human standards, 1200 years, 1560 years, but they are dramatically shorter than the Antediluvian periods. Something changed. The same institution continues, but under different conditions. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation myth preserved on a tablet from approximately 1600 BC, provides additional context. The text is fragmentary, but it describes the establishment of the first cities, the institution of kingship, and the circumstances that led to the flood. The tablet was excavated from Nippur and is now divided between the University Museum in Philadelphia and the Istanbul Museum. In the preserved portions, the god Enki appears as a protector of humanity. When the other gods decree the flood to destroy the noise and overpopulation of human civilization, Enki warns Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, instructing him to build a boat and preserve the seed of all living things. This pattern repeats across multiple Mesopotamian flood narratives. In the Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, Enki warns the human Atrahasis. In Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enki warns Utnapishtim. The names change, the details vary, but the structure remains constant. Enki defies the divine council to preserve human life and, by extension, human knowledge. This is not a god who views humanity as disposable. This is a god invested in its continuity. The BTM Seri ritual text, dating to the early 1st millennium BC, opens with an invocation that establishes the cosmological framework within which the Apkallu operated. Incantation, Yuana, who completed the plans of heaven and earth. This phrase appears at the beginning of a list of 7, Apkallu, and it attributes to the first sage a role in cosmic organization. Completed the plans suggests participation in creation itself, or at minimum, in the ordering of creation. The Akkadian term used here is Uzi plans or designs, the same word used in architectural and engineering contexts. The Apkallu were not philosophers contemplating abstract truths. They were beings who understood structure, who knew how the world was put together. The antediluvian world, as reconstructed from these texts, operated with 3 distinct classes of beings. At the top, the gods, the Anunnaki in Sumerian terminology, later identified with the pantheon headed by Anu, Enlil, and Enki. These beings possessed full knowledge of cosmic operations, controlled natural forces, and made decisions about the fate of creation. At the bottom, ordinary humans, workers, farmers, the masses who served the gods' temples and maintained the agricultural systems that fed the cities. These humans possessed practical knowledge sufficient for their tasks, but no understanding of the larger patterns governing their existence. Between these 2 levels existed the Apkallu. The term itself is Akkadian. The Sumerian equivalent is Abgal. Both translate roughly as sage or wise one, but the connotations go deeper. The cuneiform signs used to write Abgal combine Ab, sea, deep, and Gal great, great ones of the deep. This is not mere poetic imagery. It locates the Apkallu's origin in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that Mesopotamian cosmology placed beneath the Earth's surface, the realm of Enki. The Apkallu were described as Apkal Rabtu, great sages, distinguishing them from later scholars and experts. They possessed knowledge that ordinary humans lacked, but they operated in the human world, not in heaven with the gods. They were intermediaries, culture bearers, the beings through whom divine knowledge entered human civilization. This 3-tier structure solves a theological problem that runs through Mesopotamian literature. If the gods are immortal, all-knowing and all-powerful, and if humans are mortal, ignorant and weak, how does knowledge transfer between these realms? The gods cannot become human without ceasing to be gods. Humans cannot become gods without ceasing to be human. But the Apkallu occupy the boundary. They are described in some texts as Apkalaps, sages of the Abzu, meaning they originate in Enki's realm but operate on Earth. They bridge the ontological gap. The question that mainstream scholarship tends to treat as settled is whether this structure describes mythology or documentation. The standard interpretation reads these texts as etiological myths, explaining the origin of civilization through supernatural narratives. Knowledge appears in human society because that makes a better story than gradual development through trial and error. The Apkallu are literary devices, explanations for why the Sumerians knew things like astronomy and mathematics that seemed too sophisticated for such an early culture. But this interpretation struggles with certain textual features. The administrative precision, for one, myths explain, records document. The pairing of specific Apkallu with specific kings in the Uruk list reads less like mythology and more like archival information. The repeated attribution of technical text to these figures across centuries of scribal tradition suggests something beyond storytelling. When the catalogue of texts and authors, compiled in the Neo-Assyrian library at Nineveh around 700 BC, attributes medical handbooks and astronomical observations to Ea dictated through a dapper, it presents this information in the same format used for historical authorship of recent texts. Consider the alternative reading. What if the Sumerians inherited a situation they were trying to document accurately? What if kingship really did descend from heaven, not literally from the sky, but from a prior civilization, a prior knowledge base, a prior organizing structure that was remembered but no longer fully understood? What if the Apkallu were not inventions to explain culture, but actual figures whose knowledge preserves something older than Sumer itself? This interpretation treats the flood as a genuine catastrophe that broke historical continuity. Before the flood, a civilization existed that had accumulated knowledge across periods measured differently than we measure history. That civilization was destroyed. Afterward, the survivors, those warned by Enki, those who preserved seeds and animals and knowledge, faced the task of rebuilding. The Apkallu would then be the knowledge carriers, the ones who remembered enough to restart complex civilization rather than begin from scratch. The Antediluvian king lists, with their impossible reign lengths, would then reflect not literal chronology, but the time scale of the old system being remembered in a new context. The sudden reduction in post-flood reign lengths would mark not a shift from mythology to history, but the shift from one calendar system to another, from one way of measuring time to another, from a pre-catastrophe framework to a post-catastrophe one. The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood this transition as institutional. Kingship had to descend from heaven twice, because the flood broke the chain. The same institution, the same structure, but it had to be re-established. And alongside that re-establishment of kingship came the re-establishment of the sage system, the Apkallu who would guide the new dynasties with knowledge preserved from before the waters rose. The Eridu Genesis is fragmentary, but one line survives with haunting clarity: all the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood swept over the cult centres, not just the places where humans lived, but the places where knowledge was housed, where the connection between earth and heaven was maintained, where the Apkallu had taught and the scribes had recorded. The catastrophe was epistemological as much as physical. It destroyed not just people, but the infrastructure of wisdom. The texts insist that something survived, not by accident, not by luck, but by deliberate preservation. Enki warned specific individuals. Those individuals brought specific knowledge. The civilization that re-emerged after the flood was not starting from zero. It was restarting from a preserved archive, a maintained tradition, a deliberate transmission. The institutional framework suggested by these texts is more complex than the mainstream mythological reading acknowledges. It implies a world before the flood in which knowledge was organized, where sages held formal positions advising kings, where the relationship between divine wisdom and human governance was systematically maintained. It implies that the flood interrupted but did not destroy this system, that the same relationships were reconstituted afterward, and that the later Mesopotamian scribes understood themselves to be working within an unbroken tradition reaching back before the catastrophe. Whether this framework describes actual historical conditions or represents how the Sumerians understood their own origins, the texts preserve a consistent picture. Knowledge did not evolve in Mesopotamia. It was transmitted. And the transmitters had names, positions, and documented relationships with the centres of power. The bloodline of the Apkallu, if we can call it that, was not genetic so much as institutional, a chain of transmission that carried specific knowledge through specific channels, from beings who possessed it to kings who required it, across a break in history that should have erased everything. The 7 who came from the waters. The Betim Seri text provides the most detailed roster of the Antediluvian Apkallu that has survived in cuneiform sources. The title translates as House of Confinement or Protected House, and the text functioned as an apotropaic ritual, a set of incantations and instructions for creating magical protection around a dwelling. Multiple copies of this ritual have been recovered from near Assyrian sites, particularly from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The ritual prescribes the manufacture of small clay figurines representing protective spirits, including the Apkallu, which were to be buried at specific points in the walls and foundations of a house to ward off evil. But before the ritual instructions come the names. 7 Apkallu, who existed before the flood. The incantation that opens the text and names these beings was not composed by the Neo-Assyrian scribes who copied it. The language, the formulas, the structure all point to a much older tradition being preserved, copied and recopied across centuries because it was understood to contain authentic knowledge from the distant past. The incantation reads, Uana, who completed the plans of heaven and earth, Uaniduga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence, Enmeduga, to whom a good fate was allotted, Enmegalama, who was born in a house, Enmebeluga, who grew up on a pasture, and Enlilda, the purification, priest of Eridu, Abzu, who ascended to heaven. 7 names, 7 beings, each described with a phrase that distinguishes them, gives them individuality, suggests specific roles or origins or achievements. These are not generic wise men, these are identified individuals, and the ritual insists on naming all 7 before their protective function can be invoked. The first name, Uana, appears in multiple other texts, sometimes shortened to Yuan. Scholarly consensus connects this figure with Adapa, the sage most extensively documented in Mesopotamian mythology, and with Oannes, the fish being described by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BC. The phrase completed the plans of heaven and earth attributes to Uana participation in cosmic organization at the highest level. The Akkadian verb, translated as completed, is gamru, which carries meanings of perfection, totality, bringing something to its proper end. Uana did not merely understand the structure of reality, he was involved in bringing that structure to completion. Uanaduga receives the epithet Uznurapatu, broad understanding or comprehensive intelligence. The term Uznu literally means ear, but in Mesopotamian idiom it stands for intelligence, perception, understanding, the capacity to hear and comprehend instruction from the divine realm. The phrase suggests not specialized knowledge in one area, but comprehensive grasp across all domains. Uanaduga knew widely, understood deeply, perceived connections. Enmeduga's description is more passive, to whom a good fate was allotted. The terminology of fate was central to Mesopotamian theology. Fates were decreed by the gods, particularly by Enlil in his role as king of the gods, and once decreed they were fixed. That Enmeduga's fate is specified as good implies perhaps that the other Apkallu's fates were more ambiguous, or that his role involved less conflict with the divine order, or simply that his survival and his knowledge-bearing function were ensured by divine decree. Enmegalama was born in a house. This phrase stands out for its specificity. Not born from the waters, like some descriptions of Apkallu origin, not descended from heaven, born in a house. The Akkadian term Batu can mean a physical dwelling, but it can also mean a temple or an administrative building. Some scholars have suggested this phrase indicates Enmegalama was the first of the Apkallu to be born in a human context rather than emerging fully formed from Enki's realm, representing perhaps a transition toward more human-like sages, foreshadowing the later human descent Apkallu who appear after the flood. Enmebeluga grew up on a pasture or on a riverbank. The term Ru can refer to open country, to areas outside the city walls where shepherds took their flocks, or to the floodplains alongside rivers. This description contrasts with Emegalama's house birth. Emebeluga's origin is rural, outside the urban temple centres. The phrase might indicate that his knowledge was different in kind, perhaps agricultural, perhaps related to animal husbandry, perhaps concerning the natural world beyond the city limits where most Mesopotamian texts were produced. Enlilda carries the title Pau, a Eridu, purification priest of Eridu. This is the only one of the 7 given an explicitly priestly title, and it ties him directly to the first city, the city where kingship first descended from heaven, the city of Enki's temple. Purification priests performed ritual cleansing ceremonies, removing pollution from people, objects, and spaces. The role required detailed knowledge of purity laws, incantation formulas, and ritual procedures. That Enlilda held this position in Eridu specifically suggests he was the channel through which the ritual knowledge of the god's city was transmitted to human practitioners. Abzu ascended to heaven. This phrase requires careful interpretation. The verb el means to go up, to ascend, and heaven Namaharam Laman is the realm of the gods, particularly of Anu, the Sky Father. Several Mesopotamian traditions describe figures who ascended to heaven. Adapa, in his confrontation with Anu, Enmedaranki, who was shown celestial secrets by the sun god Shamash, later traditions about Enoch in the Jewish texts. In each case, ascension to heaven represents a boundary crossing, a movement into divine space to receive knowledge not available on earth. Abzu's ascension suggests he gained access to information the other 6 did not possess, or that his role involved mediating between earthly civilization and the cosmic patterns visible only from the divine perspective. After naming these 7, the BTM Psi text adds a clarifying phrase: the pure carp, the carp of the sea, the 7 sages of the Abzu. The term Purdu is translated as carp, but may refer more generally to a type of fish sacred to Enki. This designation as fish beings appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian art. Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs depict human figures wearing the skin and head of a fish like a cloak, the fish head visible above the human head, the fish body hanging down the back. These figures appear at doorways and entrances, positioned as guardians, often holding a bucket in one hand and a pine cone in the other. The question these descriptions raise is what sort of knowledge each Apkallu brought. If the 7 represent not duplicates of each other, but specialists in different domains, then together they constitute a complete system of knowledge. Uana with cosmic structure, Uanaduga with comprehensive intelligence across all areas, Emmeduga with fate and time, Emmegalama with urban civilization and temple procedure, Emmebeluga with agriculture and the natural world, and Enlilda with purification rituals and religious law, Abzu with astronomy and celestial patterns. This distribution would make sense if the Apkallu were not mythological symbols but actual knowledge transmission systems. A civilization requires multiple types of expertise to function. You need cosmology to understand your place in the universe. You need comprehensive synthetic thinking to connect different domains. You need understanding of time and causation. You need urban administration. You need agricultural productivity. You need religious ritual to maintain cosmic order. You need astronomical observation to track seasons and predict patterns. 7 sages covering 7 essential knowledge domains. The Era Epic, a Babylonian poem dated to the 9th century BC, contains a speech by the god Marduk that provides external corroboration for this 7-sage tradition. In Tablet 1, Marduk laments the absence of the craftsman he needs to restore his statue after the flood. Where are the 7 sages of the Abzu, the pure Purdu fish, who just like their lord Ea are perfect in sublime wisdom? Who can make my body holy? This passage confirms several details: the 7-fold number, their designation as Purdu fish, their origin in the Abzu, Ea's realm, their possession of Inmake, wisdom of the highest order, described as sublime or transcendent, and it confirms their absence. They are not available in Marduk's present moment. They existed before, but they exist no longer in the same accessible form. The Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs provide visual documentation of how these beings were imagined. The fish Apkallu figures carved in stone at Nimrud during the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, 883-859 BC, show humanoid beings draped in what appears to be a complete fish skin. The head of the fish sitting atop the human head like a hood, the body of the fish hanging down the back like a cape. The figures are bearded, muscular, standing in profile. They hold a bucket in their left hand, contents unknown, and originally held a pine cone or similar object in the raised right hand, as if performing a gesture of blessing or purification. These relief figures were positioned at doorways, especially at entrances to important rooms in the palace. They appear in pairs, flanking passages, creating a symbolic gateway through which one must pass to enter the protected space beyond. The archaeological context suggests they functioned apotropaically, their presence warded off evil, their knowledge created a boundary that malevolent forces could not cross. But these are representations created 2,000 years after the flood. They show how the Neo-Assyrians imagined the Antediluvian sages, not necessarily how those sages actually appeared or operated. The fish imagery might be literal, beings who were part human, part fish. It might be symbolic, representing their origin from the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. It might be professional costume, ritual garb worn by specialists who took the name and role of Apkallu in later periods, claiming continuity with the antediluvian figures. What cannot be disputed is the consistency across sources. The BT Emseri incantation names 7. The Era Epic references 7. The Uruk list implicitly counts 7 antediluvian Apkallu paired with early kings. The palace reliefs multiply the image but maintain the core identity. Across 1,000 years of textual and artistic tradition, from the Old Babylonian period through the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the number holds: 7 sages before the flood, 7 beings who came from the waters, 7 carriers of the knowledge that built civilization. The names themselves carry weight in a culture that believed names held power. These were not generic titles. They were specific identities, preserved and transmitted with exactitude across centuries of copying. Scribes did not casually alter these names. They reproduced them letter for letter, sign for sign, because the names were understood to designate real beings, real sources of real knowledge, and changing the names would break the chain of authenticity connecting the ritual text back to the antediluvian origin. The BTM Siri ritual continues after listing the 7 with instructions for manufacturing small clay figurines representing these beings, specifying their placement in the foundation deposits of a house. These figurines have been recovered archaeologically. They are small, roughly made, usually unfired or lightly fired clay. They were buried in walls, under thresholds, at corners, anywhere a boundary needed protection. The ritual practice extended the Apkallu's protective function from the antediluvian past into the historical present. By invoking their names and burying their images, a homeowner could access the same knowledge and power that had protected humanity before the flood. This raises an uncomfortable question for the purely mythological interpretation. If these were merely symbolic figures, why would practical-minded Mesopotamians, living in historical cities, invest time and resources in creating and deploying these images? Ritual practice assumes efficacy. You perform a ritual because you believe it works. The BTM Seri ritual was not literature for entertainment. It was a practical manual for a procedure that people actually performed in their actual houses to achieve actual protection. The mainstream explanation holds that the ritual worked through psychological reassurance, through the placebo effect of feeling protected. But the texts themselves insist on something else. They insist that the Apkallu possessed actual knowledge, that this knowledge included understanding of how protection operates, and that invoking their names and creating their images established a genuine connection to that antediluvian wisdom system. What if the Sumerians were right about that? Not right in the sense that clay figurines magically repel demons, but right in the sense that they had inherited a legitimate knowledge tradition from before the catastrophe, and the ritual was one method of accessing and applying that knowledge. The 7 who came from the waters would then be not inventions, but memories, documented, named, preserved with administrative precision, because they were understood to be real figures whose knowledge had actually built the civilization the Sumerians inherited. Adapa, the first to know. Among the 7 Apkallu named in the BT Mseri text, the first, Yuana, holds a unique position in Mesopotamian tradition. Multiple sources identify Yuana with a figure called Adapa, and Adapa is the only one of the 7 for whom a complete mythological narrative survives. That narrative exists in fragments across several clay tablets, the most important being the Amarna tablets discovered in Egypt in 1887, now housed in the British Museum under catalogue numbers K8214 and K8743. These tablets date to the 14th century BC, written in Akkadian, part of the diplomatic correspondence archive of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. The myth begins in Eridu, the first city. Adapa holds the title Apkallu, which in this context functions both as a descriptor of his nature and as an official position. He serves the temple of Ea in Eridu as a baker and fisherman, providing food for the daily offerings. The text describes him as Robdu, princely sage, and states that Ea made him wise with broad understanding to disclose the designs of the land. The phrase Urt-Mti refers to architectural plans, engineering designs, the organisational structures by which civilization functions. Ea gave Adapa knowledge of how society is constructed. The text continues, wisdom he gave to him, eternal life he did not give to him. This distinction is central to understanding Adapa's role. He possesses divine-level knowledge. He lacks divine-level existence. He knows what the gods know, but he remains subject to mortality. This creates a theological tension that drives the entire narrative. The inciting incident occurs while Adapa is fishing on the sea. The south wind rises suddenly and capsizes his boat, throwing him into the water. In rage, Adapa curses the wind, "South wind, I will break your wing." The text states simply, "He broke the wing of the south wind." For 7 days the south wind does not blow. In a region where the south wind brings essential moisture and cooling to the coastal areas, 7 days without it represents a significant disruption of natural patterns. This event reaches the attention of Anu, the sky god, king of the pantheon. Anu summons Adapa to heaven to answer for his actions. But before Adapa ascends, Ea warns him. The instruction is specific. When Anu offers you food and water, refuse them, because they will be the food and water of death. However, if he offers you garment and oil, accept them. Ea is preparing Adapa for a test, protecting his student from divine treachery. Adapa travels to heaven. The gate is guarded by 2 gods, Dumuzi and Gizida, who intercede on Adapa's behalf, presenting him favourably to Anu. When Adapa appears before the divine council, Anu questions him about the broken wing of the south wind. Adapa explains that he was crossing the sea for fish when the south wind attacked him, and he responded by breaking its wing. Anu's response reveals the central problem. Why did Ea disclose to an imperfect human the design of heaven and earth, and endow him with an arrogant heart? The Akkadian term kaba, translated as arrogant, carries connotations of pride, presumption, overstepping appropriate boundaries. From Anu's perspective, Adapa should not have the power to affect natural phenomena like the south wind. That ability belongs to gods, not humans. The fact that Adapa could break the wind's wing demonstrates that he possesses knowledge and power beyond his station. But then Anu does something unexpected. Instead of punishing Adapa, He offers him the food and water of immortality. Adapa, following Ea's instructions, refuses. Anu asks why. Adapa explains that Ea commanded him not to eat or drink. Anu laughs. The food and water were not poison. They were the gifts that would make Adapa fully divine, that would complete his transformation from mortal sage to immortal god. The text records Anu's final judgment: "You have refused the food and water of life. Take him and return him to his earth." Adapa goes back to Eridu, still mortal, still bound to die, despite possessing the knowledge of the gods. This outcome has puzzled interpreters for over a century. Why would Ea deceive his own student, preventing him from accepting immortality? Various explanations have been proposed. Some scholars argue Ea was protecting humanity's status. If Adapa had become fully divine, the knowledge transmission system would have ended. Others suggest Ea was jealous, unwilling to see his student elevated to his own level. Still, others propose that Anu was actually offering death disguised as life, and Ea's warning saved Adapa from that trap. But there is another reading, less commonly articulated. What if Ea's deception was necessary to maintain Adapa's function? The text explicitly states that Anu planned to keep Adapa in heaven, to set Adapa at his service, establishing Adapa's freedom from Ea. If Adapa had stayed in heaven, he would have been removed from his role as knowledge transmitter to human civilization. He would have become one more sage in the divine court, valuable to Anu but lost to humanity. By refusing the food and water, Adapa remains mortal. He returns to earth, and there he continues his work, which the catalogue of texts and authors defines clearly. Adapa wrote down the knowledge that Ea dictated, the medical texts, the astronomical observations, the divinatory procedures. All of this was PE of the mouth of Ea, but written by Adapa's hand. Adapa's power over the south wind requires examination. The text does not present this as metaphorical. Adapa spoke words, and the south wind's wing broke. The phrase kapu means literally to bend, to curve, to break. The south wind was physically affected by Adapa's speech. This demonstrates mastery of language as a force that operates on reality, not just on social relations or communication, but on the physical world itself. Mesopotamian magical practice was built on this understanding. Words, if properly formulated and properly spoken by someone with the requisite knowledge, could change material conditions. Incantations could heal disease, ward off demons, purify pollution, bind or release spirits. The operative principle was not superstition, but epistemology. Language was understood as a technology, and like any technology, it required expertise to operate effectively. Adapa possessed that expertise at the highest level. He knew the Nilni, the oath of the gods, the secret names and formulas through which divine power could be invoked. His ability to break the south wind's wing was not magic in the sense of violating natural law. It was magic in the sense of applying linguistic technology to natural phenomena, using knowledge of how reality is structured to restructure it through speech. The Adapa myth functions on multiple levels. As mythology, it explains why humans have wisdom but not immortality. As theology, it establishes the boundary between human and divine status. But as documentation, it describes the process by which knowledge moved from the divine realm through a specific individual into human civilization. Adapa is the channel. The knowledge flows through him because Ea chose him for that purpose, gave him the necessary understanding, tested him before the highest gods, and then sent him back to earth to transmit what he had learned. The test before Anu serves as legitimation. Anu himself, king of the gods, acknowledges that Adapa possesses divine level knowledge. When Anu complains that Ea gave Adapa the design of heaven and earth, he is not questioning whether Adapa has that knowledge, he is questioning whether a human should have been given it. But having acknowledged the fact, Anu cannot take the knowledge back. Adapa returns to Earth with divine attestation of his wisdom, with the highest god's confirmation that he genuinely possesses the secrets of cosmic order. This narrative structure appears again in other Mesopotamian traditions. Enmeduranki, a king of Sippar, is taken to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad, shown the secrets of divination, taught to read omens from the liver and from oil on water, then sent back to Earth to teach these arts to his son. The Book of Enoch in Jewish tradition presents a similar pattern. Enoch is taken to heaven, shown the astronomical secrets, the calendar, the movements of the heavenly bodies, then returns to teach his sons and write books preserving this knowledge. The pattern suggests a systematic process. Divine knowledge does not simply appear in human civilization through random inspiration or gradual discovery. It is transmitted through specific individuals who undergo a legitimation process involving ascent to the divine realm, instruction by the gods, and then return to Earth with a mandate to teach. Adapa represents the prototype of this process, the first to undergo it, the model for all subsequent knowledge transmission. The Amarna tablets preserve only fragments of the Adapa story. Additional fragments have been recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, also housed in the British Museum. These later copies, dated to the 7th century BC, prove that the story was still being copied and presumably still considered important nearly a millennium after the Amarna version was written. The persistence of this narrative across time and space suggests it served a function beyond entertainment. It was foundational literature, establishing the paradigm by which Mesopotamian scholars understood their own role as inheritors and transmitters of ancient wisdom. When the catalogue of texts and authors attributes multiple scholarly disciplines to Adapa writing at Ea's dictation, it is not merely citing legend. It is describing the believed origin point of the entire scribal tradition. Adapa was the first to write. Not the first to make marks on clay, there were earlier writing systems, but the first to write down knowledge that came from beyond the human domain, knowledge that could not have been derived from human observation or experimentation alone, knowledge that required divine instruction. This claim about Adapa's authorship was taken seriously by scholars who lived thousands of years after the supposed events. They believed they were working within a tradition that stretched back to the first city, to the first sage, to the moment when Ea decided that humans required wisdom to survive and thrive. They understood their own work, copying texts, writing commentaries, training students, as participation in a chain of transmission that had never been broken, that connected them directly to Adapa, and through Adapa to Ea, and through Ea to the source of all knowledge in the Abzu. Whether Adapa was a historical individual, a composite figure representing a knowledge transmission system, or a pure mythological creation, the fact remains that Mesopotamian civilization organized itself around the belief in his existence. The ritual texts invoked his name. The scholarly texts attributed authorship to him. The king lists connected him to specific rulers. The art depicted him in fish form as a protective guardian. For 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history, Adapa was treated not as a character in a story, but as the foundation of an institution. That institution was the transmission of knowledge from beings who possessed it to humans who required it. And the texts insist that this transmission did not begin with human cleverness, did not develop gradually through trial and error, but was given deliberately and systematically by E through the first of the 7 who came from the waters. The catalogue of impossible authorship. In the 7th century BC, the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal assembled what may have been the most comprehensive library in the ancient world. The site of Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, yielded thousands of clay tablets when archaeologists excavated the palace ruins in the 19th century. Among those tablets was a text known to modern scholarship as the Catalogue of Texts and Authors, catalogued as K167 in the British Museum collection. The tablet itself is fragmentary, but enough survives to reveal its purpose. It was an index of scholarly literature, listing major texts and attributing them to specific authors. What makes this catalogue extraordinary is not its existence. Libraries require organisation, but its attributions. The texts listed are not assigned to recent scholars or even to historical kings. They are attributed to gods and to the antediluvian sages. The catalogue organises the entire corpus of Mesopotamian technical knowledge into a hierarchy of authorship that reaches back before the flood. The opening section of the catalogue states the series of exorcism, the series of lamentation songs, the celestial omen series, Enma Anu Enlil, the series of physiognomic omens, the series of birth omens, the manual of the symptoms for diagnosis. All of these are of the mouth of E. P.E. of the mouth of E. The phrase appears repeatedly throughout the catalogue. It designates primary authorship. These texts did not originate with human observation or innovation. They came from the God of wisdom, directly from the source of all knowledge. But the catalogue adds a crucial detail. Adapa wrote them down at his dictation. The process described here is dictation. Ea speaks, Adapa writes. The content is divine, but the act of recording is performed by the Apkallu. This division of labour explains how divine knowledge becomes accessible to human civilization. Gods do not write tablets. They do not train in scribal schools, learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs, practicing on broken potsherds before graduating to proper clay. That work belongs to the mediator, the translator, the one who stands between the divine source and the human recipient. The texts attributed to E through Adapa span the core disciplines of Mesopotamian scholarship. The exorcism series, Maklu and Makil, containing rituals for driving out demons and witchcraft. The lamentation songs, Irema and Irua, sung during religious festivals to placate angry deities. The massive omen series Enma Anu Enlil, consisting of at least 70 tablets recording celestial observations and their interpretations, the foundation of Mesopotamian astronomy and astrology. Physiognomic omens, predicting character and fate from physical features. Birth omens, determining the future based on circumstances of delivery. Medical diagnostic texts, correlating symptoms with treatments. This is not a random collection. These are the technical disciplines required to run a civilization. Exorcism addresses spiritual threats to individuals and communities. Lamentations maintain proper relationship with the gods, preventing divine anger that could manifest as drought, plague, or military defeat. Celestial omens provide advance warning of significant events, allowing rulers to take preventive action. Physiognomy aids in selecting personnel for important positions. Birth omens guide family planning and lineage management. Medical diagnosis prevents disease from spreading and treats illness when prevention fails. If we take the catalogue at face value, all of these systems came from a single source, Ea, transmitted through a single individual, Adapa. The implication is that antediluvian civilization possessed an integrated knowledge system, and that system survived the catastrophe through deliberate preservation. Adapa wrote it down. Those writings were saved. And post-flood scholars accessed those preserved texts, copied them, transmitted them, maintained them across centuries as the core curriculum of Mesopotamian higher education. The mainstream scholarly interpretation treats these attributions as fictional. From this perspective, the Mesopotamians developed these systems gradually over centuries of observation and practice. Attributing them to divine origin was a way of claiming authority, of making texts seem more legitimate by connecting them to the gods. The catalogue of texts and authors then becomes a political document, establishing a mythology of origins to validate current practice. But this interpretation struggles with certain anomalies. First, the sophistication of the systems being attributed. The celestial omen series Enma Anu Enlil required centuries of systematic observation to compile, tracking the movements of planets, recording unusual phenomena, correlating those phenomena with subsequent events, building a database of correspondences. If this knowledge really was developed from scratch by post-flood observers, why attribute it to Ea and Adapa instead of to the actual observers who did the work? Second, the consistency of attribution across multiple independent sources. The catalogue is not the only text claiming Ea-Adapa authorship. Medical texts include colophons stating they are PEA. Omen series cite Adapa as source. Exorcism manuals invoke his authority. This consistency across different types of texts, composed at different periods, preserved in different libraries, suggests not a single political invention, but a persistent tradition of genuine belief in these origins. Third, the specificity of the authorship chain. The catalogue does not merely say the gods gave us this knowledge. It names Ea specifically, links him to Adapa specifically, and places this transmission in a specific time, the Antediluvian period. If this were pure mythology, we would expect more generic attributions. The precision suggests an attempt to document actual transmission history. Consider the alternative reading. What if Mesopotamian scribes genuinely believed they had inherited pre-catastrophe texts? What if the library at Eridu or Sippar or another antediluvian city survived in some form, buried, sealed, preserved from the waters? When post-flood scholars accessed those archives, they would have found texts in a style and language they recognized but attributed to a time before their own civilization began. Those texts would have been authoritative by virtue of their age and their content. They contained knowledge the current civilization possessed, but could not explain how it had been acquired. The Medical Symptoms Manual described diseases and treatments that worked. The celestial omens predicted events with better than random accuracy. The exorcism rituals produced effects. This knowledge could not have been invented recently because it showed the marks of long development, of accumulated observation, of refinement across multiple generations. The only explanation that made sense to Mesopotamian scholars was that this knowledge came from before the flood, from the antediluvian sages who had direct access to divine instruction. E had taught Adapa. Adapa had written it down. The flood had destroyed most copies, but enough survived that post-flood civilization could rebuild its knowledge systems by copying and studying these ancient texts. This reconstruction explains several otherwise puzzling features of Mesopotamian intellectual life. The extreme conservatism of the scribal tradition, for instance. Texts were copied with obsessive accuracy, sign by sign, preserving even archaic spellings and obsolete grammatical forms. Students spent years memorizing sign lists and standard compositions. Innovation was discouraged. The ideal scribe reproduced exactly what had been written before. This conservatism makes sense if the texts being copied were understood to preserve irreplaceable knowledge from before a catastrophe. You do not innovate with texts you believe contain the only surviving record of divine instruction. You preserve them. You memorize them. You train your students to reproduce them with absolute fidelity. Any change risks losing information that can never be recovered because the source, Ea teaching Adapa in the antediluvian world, no longer exists. The catalogue continues beyond the Ea-Adapa attributions. It lists texts attributed to other antediluvian figures, mathematical tables to Enki, architectural plans to Enmegalama, agricultural treatises to Enmebuluga. Each of the 7 Apkallu is credited with expertise in specific domains, and specific texts in those domains are traced back to their authorship. After the antediluvian section, the catalogue lists post-flood authors. These are human scholars, Manu, whose names appear in other historical records. Their contributions are described as commentaries, elaborations, applications of the foundational knowledge preserved from the antediluvian sages. They did not create new systems. They explicated, refined, and transmitted the old ones. This structure of knowledge organization, primary divine revelation through antediluvian sages, followed by human scholarship working within that revealed framework, shaped Mesopotamian intellectual culture for its entire existence. When an Assyrian king like Ashurbanipal boasted of his learning, he did not claim to have invented anything. He claimed to have mastered the ancient texts, to have learned the wisdom of Adapa, to be able to read inscriptions from before the flood. His prestige came from connection to the old knowledge, not from innovation. The concept of intellectual property in Mesopotamia worked differently than in modern contexts. Texts did not belong to their physical authors, they belonged to their sources. When a scribe composed a new commentary on an old text, he did not sign it with his own name claiming ownership. He placed it within the tradition, attributing the core knowledge to its ultimate source, E or Adapa, or whichever sage had first transmitted that particular domain of wisdom. This system preserved stability but limited innovation. If all true knowledge came from divine revelation transmitted by the antediluvian sages, then the post-flood role of scholarship was conservation and interpretation, not discovery. You could clarify obscure passages, you could apply ancient principles to new situations, but you could not claim to have found something genuinely new, because all genuine knowledge already existed in the antediluvian corpus. The only question was whether it had survived the flood, and whether current scholars had access to it. The catalogue of texts and authors thus functions as more than a library index. It is a statement of epistemology. It defines where knowledge comes from, how it is transmitted, and what the role of the scholar is. Knowledge comes from the gods. It is transmitted through the Apkallu. Scholars access it by studying the texts those sages wrote. The entire intellectual edifice of Mesopotamian civilization rests on this foundation, the claim that Adapa wrote down what Ea dictated, and that those writings survived, and that we can still read them. Whether this claim was historically accurate or believed fiction, it had real effects. It determined what texts were considered authoritative. It shaped pedagogical practice in scribal schools. It influenced how kings justified their rule, claiming access to the ancient wisdom. It structured the relationship between scholarship and religion, between human learning and divine knowledge, between the post-flood present and the antediluvian past. The impossible authorship, texts attributed to beings who existed before history, written by sages who bridged the gap between gods and humans, was not impossible to the Mesopotamians. It was foundational. It explained their world, it justified their practices, and it preserved across 3 millennia a consistent testimony. Knowledge came to us from before the flood through beings called Apkallu, and the first and greatest of those beings was called Adapa. Fishmen on palace walls. The Neo-Assyrian palace at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, was built by Ashurnasirpal II between 883 and 859 BC. The palace occupied a prominent position on the citadel mound, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Its walls were lined with massive stone relief panels depicting the king in ritual and military contexts, demonstrating his power, piety, and connection to the divine order. Among these reliefs, positioned at strategic points, doorways, entrances to throne rooms, passages between public and private spaces, appear figures that are neither fully human nor fully divine. They are the Apkallu. 3 distinct types of Apkallu figure appear in Neo-Assyrian palace art. The first and most common shows a human form draped in what appears to be a complete fish skin. The head of the fish sits atop the human head like a hood or helmet. The fish body extends down the figure's back like a cloak, the tail hanging near the feet. The figure beneath is clearly human, bearded face, muscular limbs, erect posture. But the fish covering transforms the identity, marking this as something more than an ordinary man. The second type depicts a human figure with the head of an eagle, and wings extending from the shoulders. These bird-headed Apkallu stand in similar poses to the fish-cloaked figures, performing the same gestures, positioned at similar locations within the palace architecture. The mixture of human body and raptor head creates a being that is composite, liminal, belonging fully to neither earth nor sky. The third type appears less frequently and shows a fully human form with no animal features, but carrying the same ritual implements and positioned in the same protective contexts as the hybrid figures. These have been interpreted as either human priests taking on the role of Apkallu in ritual contexts, or as representations of the later, post-flood Apkallu who were described in texts as being of human descent. All three types share certain consistent features. They carry a bucket in one hand, usually the left. The bucket appears to be made of metal, perhaps bronze, with a curved handle. In the raised right hand, they hold what has been variously identified as a pine cone, a date palm spathe, or a purification sprinkler. The gesture is the same across all depictions. The object is raised toward the wall or doorway, as if sprinkling or applying something from the bucket onto the surface being protected. The positioning of these figures within the palace architecture is not random. They appear in pairs flanking doorways, creating a guarded threshold. They appear in sequence along corridors, creating a protected path. They appear at corners where walls meet, protecting the structural joints. Their placement suggests they functioned as apotropaic guardians, beings whose presence warded off evil, whose ritual knowledge created barriers that hostile forces could not cross. The British Museum holds multiple panels showing these figures, excavated by Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s. Panel BM 14536 shows a fish Apkallu from the temple of Ninurta at Nimrud. The figure stands roughly 2.3 metres tall, carved in fine-grained limestone. The fish covering is rendered in precise detail, scales indicated by careful parallel lines, fins clearly delineated, the fish head's eye and mouth visible. The human figure beneath wears a short kilt, his bare chest showing muscular definition. His beard is long and carefully curled in the Assyrian style. The bucket he carries has a rounded bottom and flared rim. The pine cone in his raised hand is depicted as a cluster of scales arranged in a spiral pattern. The Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul preserves similar panels, also from Nimrud. The Istanbul fish Apkallu figures show slight variations, different positions of the feet, different angles of the raised hand, but the core iconography remains constant. Fish covering, bucket, sprinkler, protective positioning. These are not individual portraits showing different people. They are standardized representations of a single concept, repeated throughout the palace complex to create comprehensive magical protection. The bird-headed Apkallu panels show similar consistency. The eagle head is depicted in profile, the hooked beak prominent, the eye large and round, the feathered crest rising above the head. The wings extend from the shoulders, rendered in meticulous detail with individual feathers delineated, but the body remains human. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture, human clothing. The mixture creates a being that could fly like the birds of heaven, but walk like the humans of earth. Another form of liminality, another bridge between realms. The ritual gesture these figures perform, raising the pine cone or sprinkler, dipping it in the bucket, applying it to the wall, connects them to actual Mesopotamian purification rituals documented in texts. The Betium Siri ritual, which names the 7 Apkallu, includes instructions for manufacturing protective figurines and sprinkling them with water from the Abzu mixed with various purifying substances. The ritual gesture, carved in stone on the palace walls, depicts the same action described in the cuneiform texts. This correspondence between text and image strengthens the case that these representations reflect genuine belief, not mere decoration. The craftsmen who carved these panels were depicting ritual specialists performing ritual actions. The knowledge those specialists possessed, how to purify spaces, how to establish protective boundaries, how to ward off demons, was understood to derive from the antediluvian Apkallu, and the stone figures embodied that knowledge visibly, making it permanently present within the palace architecture. The fish imagery requires deeper examination. Why would sages of primordial wisdom be depicted as fishmen? The standard scholarly explanation points to their origin in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that was Enki's domain. Fish come from water. The Apkallu came from the Abzu. Therefore, fish form symbolises their origin. But there may be more to it. Fish in Mesopotamian culture were associated with fertility, abundance, and the life-giving properties of fresh water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers teemed with fish that provided essential protein to the population. Fishing was both subsistence practice and economic activity. The carp specifically, pudu, the type of fish associated with the Apkallu in textual sources, was considered sacred to Enki. To depict the Apkallu as fishmen may have been a way of emphasising not just their origin, but their function. They brought abundance. They provided nourishment, not physical food, but knowledge food, the intellectual and spiritual sustenance required for civilization to thrive. They came from the realm of fresh water, the source of agricultural fertility, the substance without which Mesopotamian civilization could not exist. The fish form was not arbitrary symbolism. It was specific iconography connecting the Apkallu to the fundamental processes that sustained life. The bird-headed variants raise different questions. Birds occupy an intermediate position in Mesopotamian cosmology. They belong to Earth, where they nest and feed, but they can ascend to heaven, crossing the boundary humans cannot normally cross. Eagle-headed Apkallu might represent those sages whose knowledge specifically concerned celestial matters, astronomy, the movement of planets, the patterns of stars, knowledge that required observing what happens in the sky above the earth, in the realm birds can access, but humans cannot. If the 7 Apkallu specialised in different domains of knowledge, as suggested by their individual descriptions in the BTM series text, then different iconographic forms might indicate those specialisations. Fish Apkallu bringing earthly knowledge, agriculture, medicine, practical crafts, bird Apkallu bringing celestial knowledge, astronomy, meteorology, calendar systems, human form Apkallu bringing social knowledge, law, governance, ritual procedure. What is clear from the archaeological record is that these images were important enough to be rendered in permanent, expensive materials, limestone panels weighing hundreds of kilograms, requiring skilled sculptors, transported from quarries, installed with precision. Palace decoration was not casual. Every image served a purpose, communicated a message, reinforced the ideological framework supporting the king's authority. By filling his palace with Apkallu figures, Ashurnasirpal II was making multiple statements. He was demonstrating his connection to antediluvian wisdom. He was showing that his palace, like the palaces of the pre-flood kings, was protected by the same supernatural guardians. He was positioning himself as heir to a tradition stretching back to the first cities, the first kings, the first transmission of divine knowledge to human civilization. But these were not mere propaganda. The ritual texts make clear that Assyrian kings and their advisors genuinely believed in the efficacy of these protections. They performed the rituals. They buried the figurines. They positioned the stone guardians. They invested real resources in maintaining the system because they believed it worked. The palace was not just protected metaphorically or symbolically. It was protected actually through the application of knowledge preserved from the antediluvian Apkallu, knowledge that remained effective 2,000 years after the flood. Modern archaeology tends to interpret these images through the lens of art history, iconography, and political symbolism. But for the Assyrians who created and lived with these images, they were not art. They were technology. The Apkallu figured on the walls were devices, implementing the protective knowledge those beings had brought from the Abzu, maintaining boundaries against chaos and evil, ensuring that the space within remained ordered, pure and safe. This understanding of images as functional, rather than merely decorative, aligns with how Mesopotamian culture understood writing. Cuneiform texts were not just records or communication, they were active agents. The words on a medical incantation tablet did not describe healing, they performed healing. The words on a boundary stone did not record a property claim, they enforced it. Similarly, the Apkallu images on palace walls did not symbolize protection, they enacted it. If we take seriously the Mesopotamian belief that these images worked, we must ask what they believed was happening. The mainstream position would be that the psychological comfort of feeling protected was the actual mechanism, but the texts and images themselves insist on something more. They insist that the Apkallu possessed actual knowledge of how protection operates, that this knowledge was real and transmissible, and that applying it through ritual procedure and image installation created genuine effects. Whether those effects existed objectively or only in the belief system of the participants, the fact remains Mesopotamian civilization organized significant resources around the conviction that antediluvian sages had brought knowledge that remained accessible and applicable millennia after they disappeared. The fishmen on palace walls were not decoration. They were documentation, visual records of beings the Sumerians believed had existed, had possessed wisdom, and had transmitted that wisdom through channels that remained open for those who knew how to access them. The Uruk list, Kings and Their Shadows. The tablet catalogued as W2030-7 in the Baghdad Museum represents one of the most unusual documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Excavated by German archaeologists in 1960 from the temple precinct at Uruk, the tablet dates to the Seleucid period, specifically to 165-164 BC based on colophon dating, but the information it preserves reaches back thousands of years earlier to a time the Mesopotamians themselves considered ancient to the antediluvian world. The tablet is organised in two parallel columns. The left column lists kings. The right column lists Apkallu. Each king is paired with a sage. The structure implies relationship, institutional connection, a system by which divine knowledge was channeled into royal administration. This is not mythology arranged as narrative. This is a roster, a reference document, something to be consulted for information about who advised whom in the first cities before the waters rose. The tablet was published by Jan van Dijk in 1962 in the journal Vorläufiger Bericht Bedi von dem Deutschen Archäologischen Institut und der Deutschen Orientgesellschaft aus Mitteln der Deutschen Forschungsgemeinschaft unternommene Ausgrabungen in Uruk-Vaka. Van Dijk's edition includes a hand copy of the tablet's cuneiform text, showing the actual sign forms as they appear on the clay. The first preserved entry pairs a king named Allulim with the sage Uana. Allulim was the first king to rule from Eridu, according to the Sumerian king list. Uana was the first of the 7 Apkallu, according to the Betium Seri ritual. This pairing is not coincidental. It establishes the pattern. The first king receives guidance from the first sage. The transmission of knowledge begins at the beginning, with the founding of the first city, with the establishment of the first royal dynasty, with the creation of the first institutional structures that would define Mesopotamian civilization. The tablet continues through the antediluvian dynasties. Each king is named. Each king's reign length is given using the same enormous numbers preserved in other king list traditions, tens of thousands of years. And each king has an associated Apkallu. The names vary slightly from other lists, suggesting different textual traditions, but the core structure remains constant. 7 kings, 7 sages. Then the flood. After the flood, the tablet records a transition. The post-flood entries show kings from historical dynasties, Enmerkar of Uruk, Gilgamesh of Uruk, paired not with the original 7 Apkallu, but with different sages. The text describes these post-flood sages with a specific phrase, Zeramti, of human descent, or seed of mankind. This designation distinguishes them from the antediluvian Apkallu, who are never described as human. The 7 who came before the flood were something else. The sages who came after were human, but they carried titles and functions inherited from the antediluvian originals. The specific post-flood pairings preserved on the tablet provide crucial detail. Enmerkar, legendary king of Uruk, known from multiple Sumerian epic poems, is paired with an Apkallu named Nungol Pirigoldim. This same name appears in the Betim Siri ritual among the 4 post-flood sages of human descent. The Betim Siri text adds detail about Nungol Pirigoldim. He brought down Ishtar from heaven into the sanctuary. This phrase describes a cultic achievement, the establishment of proper worship for the goddess Ishtar in her temple at Uruk, an act requiring ritual knowledge of the highest order. Gilgamesh, the most famous of all Mesopotamian kings, the hero of the great epic that bears his name, is paired with an Apkallu named Lunana. The Betim Seri describes Lunana as 2/3 Apkallu, using the exact same fraction that the Epic of Gilgamesh uses to describe Gilgamesh himself, 2/3 god, 1/3 human. This parallel suggests deep connection between king and sage, possibly even kinship. If Lunana was 2/3 Apkallu and 1/3 human, and Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, then both occupied a liminal status. Both were hybrids, both bridged categories that were normally kept separate. The Uruk list's structure raises profound questions about how knowledge transmission actually operated in early Mesopotamia. If each king had an associated Apkallu, then the sages were not wandering teachers offering wisdom to whoever would listen. They were institutionally embedded in the power structures of the state. They held official positions. They had defined relationships with specific rulers. The system was organized, formal, documented. This challenges the common assumption that ancient knowledge transmission was informal, charismatic, based on individual inspiration or sporadic teaching. The Uruk list suggests instead a bureaucratic model, positions to be filled, roles to be performed, institutional memory to be maintained. The Apkallu were not independent sages choosing to share their wisdom. They were functionaries within a system designed to ensure that divine knowledge informed royal decision-making. If we take this model seriously, several implications follow. First, the position of Apkallu must have been hereditary or otherwise transmissible. When a king died and a new king ascended, did a new Apkallu replace the old, or did the same Apkallu serve multiple kings? The text does not specify, but the pairing structure suggests each king-sage relationship was unique and significant. The Apkallu attached to Ululim would have specific knowledge relevant to founding the first city. The Apkallu attached to Enmerkar would have different knowledge relevant to establishing Uruk as a major power. Second, the knowledge possessed by each Apkallu must have been differentiated. If all 7 antediluvian Apkallu possessed identical knowledge, there would be no reason to pair specific sages with specific kings. But if each Apkallu specialized, one in agriculture, one in architecture, one in astronomy, one in divination, one in medicine, one in ritual, one in law, then pairing would matter. A king building a new city would need the architectural Apkallu. A king establishing a new temple would need the ritual Apkallu. A king facing military crisis would need the divinatory Apkallu, who could read omens and advise on timing. Third, the transmission of Apkallu knowledge across the flood must have been systematic. The Uruk list documents post-flood sages continuing the same function the antediluvian Apkallu had performed. This implies that the flood did not erase the knowledge. It interrupted the direct line, the original 7 disappeared, descended to the Abzu as the epic describes, but the system survived. Human successors, described as of human descent, but still bearing the title Apkallu, took up the work. They possessed less than the originals. Lunanar was only 2/3 Apkallu, meaning 1/3 of the knowledge or power or status was diminished, but they possessed enough to continue the essential function. The mechanism of this transmission is what the sources leave most obscure. How did human scholars become Apkallu? The BT Memseri lists 4 names among the post-flood sages, suggesting a transition from the 7 antediluvian figures to a smaller number of human inheritors. But what qualified these 4? Were they direct descendants of the original 7? Were they students who had been trained before the flood? Were they individuals who accessed preserved texts, learned the knowledge from written sources, and then claimed the title based on mastery of the material? The catalogue of texts and authors suggests the textual route. If Adapa wrote down what Ea dictated and those texts survived, then anyone who mastered those texts could theoretically claim Apkallu status. Knowledge would transfer through study, through scribal training, through institutional education, rather than through biological inheritance. This would explain why later Umanu scholars, living centuries after the flood, could still claim connection to the antediluvian wisdom. They possessed the same texts, studied the same corpus, worked within the same tradition. But the Uruk list's emphasis on pairing specific names suggests something more than textual study. Nungul Pirigoldim brought Ishtar down from heaven. This is not something you accomplish merely by reading old tablets. It describes ritual action, performance of ceremony, implementation of procedure that actually achieved a cultic goal. The knowledge had to be operational, not just theoretical. The post-flood Apkallu had to be able to do things, not merely know things. This operational knowledge is harder to transmit through text alone. You can write down incantation formulas, but does reciting them from a tablet produce the same effect as reciting them from living memory passed through a chain of initiated practitioners? You can record the ingredients of a purification mixture, but does that teach how to properly prepare it, how to know when it's ready, how to apply it effectively? The distinction between explicit knowledge mission that can be written and tacit knowledge gil that requires direct train becomes crucial. If the Apkallu possessed primarily explicit knowledge, facts, formulas, procedures written down, then the flood need not have interrupted the tradition significantly. Preserve the tablets, and you preserve the knowledge. But if the Apkallu possess substantial tacit knowledge, embodied skill, intuitive judgment, situational wisdom gained through practice, then the flood was catastrophic. Tacit knowledge dies with its holders unless it has been transmitted through apprenticeship, through doing alongside a master, through the kind of person-to-person training that cannot happen via text alone. The Uruk list may be documenting both kinds of transmission. The antediluvian Apkallu possessed full knowledge, explicit and tacit, trained directly by Enki, operating at the highest level. The post-flood Apkallu of human descent possessed partial knowledge. They had the texts, the explicit formulas, but they lacked some portion of the tacit wisdom. They were 2/3 Apkallu, functioning adequately, maintaining the system, but not operating at the original level. This model of degraded transmission explains several features of Mesopotamian intellectual culture. The obsessive conservatism, for instance. If you know you possess only partial knowledge, you dare not innovate, because any change might discard the pieces you don't fully understand. The elaborate ritual precision. If you've lost the tacit knowledge of why a procedure works, you compensate by following every explicit instruction with absolute exactness, hoping that fidelity to the letter preserves something of the lost spirit. The reverence for antediluvian texts. If the original sages wrote these, and we can no longer match their knowledge, then these texts are precious beyond measure, irreplaceable repositories of wisdom we cannot recreate. The Uruk list itself embodies this conservatism. The tablet dates to 165-164 BC, nearly 2,000 years after the latest events it records, nearly 3,000 years after the flood it references, perhaps 5,000 years or more from the Antediluvian period it documents. Yet the Seleucid scribe copied this list faithfully, preserving names and relationships from an almost unimaginably distant past, because that information was understood to matter. The pairing of kings and sages was not historical trivia, it was institutional memory, documentation of how the system was supposed to work, evidence that divine knowledge had once been systematically integrated into human governance. What the Uruk list reveals is structure, not the content of what the Apkallu knew, but the system by which that knowledge was transmitted and applied. The texts describe wisdom, the iconography depicts ritual, but this king list documents relationship, who stood beside whom, whose voice advised which ruler, how the channel from divine wisdom to human policy was institutionally maintained. If the bloodline of the Apkallu is understood not as biological descent, but as institutional succession, then the Uruk list is a genealogy. It traces lineage not of genetics, but of authority, showing how the right to transmit primordial knowledge passed from the original 7 through their human descent successors to the Umanu scholars of later periods. Each link in that chain could claim connection back to Yuana, back to Adapa, back to Ea, back to the source. The tablet 2037 sits in its storage box in Baghdad. The information is published, translated, analysed in academic journals, but what it documents, a systematic, institutionalised relationship between royal power and divine knowledge, maintained across the catastrophe of the flood through deliberate preservation and controlled transmission, remains a claim that scholarship has not fully absorbed. The Sumerians insist they inherited wisdom from before the catastrophe. The Uruk list provides the organisational chart of that inheritance, showing exactly who transmitted what to whom, and establishing that it was not myth but institution, not story but structure, not legend but lineage. The 4 who were part human. The BT Emsiri text does not end with the 7 antediluvian Apkallu. After naming Yuana through Abzu, after calling them the pure carp of the sea, the incantation continues with 4 additional names. These are introduced with a phrase that changes everything. Erbeti Apkal Zaramlti, the 4 Apkallu, seed of mankind. The first is Nungul Pregoldim. The text specifies his achievement. He brought down Ishtar from heaven into the sanctuary. This is cultic language describing the establishment of proper divine worship. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, had to be properly installed in her temple at Uruk. The procedure required knowledge of how to invite divine presence into earthly space, how to create the conditions where a deity would consent to dwell among humans. Nungul Pirigoldim possessed that knowledge and successfully performed that operation. The second is Pirigal Nungul, born in Kish. His story is darker. He angered the god Adad in heaven, so that for 3 years he allowed neither rain nor growth in the land. What did Pirigal Nungul do to anger the storm god? The text does not say, but the consequence was agricultural catastrophe, 3 years without rain in a civilization entirely dependent on irrigation and seasonal flooding. The phrase suggests that this Apkallu possessed power, but power improperly applied, or applied in ways that conflicted with divine will. His knowledge was real enough to affect climate, but his judgment was flawed. The third is Pirigal Abzu, born in Adab. The text states he hung his seal on a goatfish, an act that angered the god Ea in the freshwater sea, so that a fuller struck him with his own seal. The goatfish was Ea's sacred animal, the constellation Capricorn. To hang a personal seal on Ea's sacred symbol suggests claiming ownership or authority over something that belonged to the god. The punishment is precise. A fuller, a laundry worker, someone of low social status, strikes Pirigal Abzu with his own seal, reversing the claim to authority. The Apkallu's power is turned against him through his own symbol. The fourth is Lunana, described explicitly as 2/3 Apkallu. The text places him during the reign of Shulgi, a historical king of the Ur III dynasty who ruled around 2094-2047 BC. Lunana's achievement was martial. He expelled a dragon from Ninkiagnuna, the temple of Ishtar. The dragon, Umgolu, was a liminal creature associated with chaos and the boundaries between ordered space and wild nature. Expelling it from the temple restored purity, eliminated threat, maintained the cosmic order within sacred space. These four names create a bridge. The 7 antediluvian Apkallu were not of human descent. Their origin was the Abzu, E's realm, something other than human. But these four are explicitly human, born in cities Kishadub, operating in historical or near-historical time periods. Yet they carry the title Apkallu and perform the same functions, establishing worship, affecting climate, dealing with sacred symbols, confronting supernatural threats. The knowledge has been transmitted, but something has diminished. Lunana is 2/3 Apkallu. The fraction is precise. Not half, not mostly, but exactly 2/3. What does it mean to possess 2/3 of Apkallu nature? If the original 7 were complete, fully equipped with divine wisdom, perfect in their knowledge, then Lunana lacks 1/3. 1/3 of the knowledge, 1/3 of the power, 1/3 of the direct connection to Ea that made the original 7 what they were. The Epic of Gilgamesh uses the same fraction to describe its hero, 2/3 god, 1/3 human. Gilgamesh is divine enough to perform superhuman feats, to survive encounters that would kill ordinary mortals, to receive visions denied to normal humans. But he is human enough to die, to fear death, to quest desperately for the immortality he cannot achieve. The mixture creates capability beyond human limits, but falling short of divine completeness. Lunana's status as 2/3 Apkallu would operate similarly, knowledge and power beyond human scholars, but less than the antediluvian originals possessed. This gradual diminishment runs through multiple Mesopotamian traditions. The Sumerian king list shows antediluvian reigns of tens of thousands of years, post-flood dynasties beginning with thousands of years, then hundreds, then approaching realistic human lifespans. The pattern is consistent. What came before the catastrophe was greater, more potent, more directly connected to divine origins. What came after was reduced, still functional, but operating at lower capacity. The phrase seed of mankind requires careful interpretation. Zuramti literally means seed of humanity or human descent. These four were born from human parents, not emerged from the Abzu. But they became Apkallu. How? The text does not explain the process. Were they trained by the antediluvian 7 before the flood? Were they born with partial Apkallu nature through some mixing of categories? Did they study preserved texts and achieve Apkallu status through mastery of the knowledge rather than through origin? If the four represent the first generation, born after the catastrophe, trained by survivors who possessed the old knowledge, then their partial status makes sense. They learned from masters who had learned from the original 7. They are twice removed from the source. Information degrades across transmission chains. Each copy introduces small errors. Each generation loses pieces of tacit knowledge that cannot be fully articulated in teaching. The four would possess substantial wisdom, enough to function as Apkallu, but not the complete system the antediluvian sages had embodied. Their mistakes become significant in this context. Pirigal-Nungul angering Adad, causing 3-year drought. Pirigal-Abzu presuming on Ea's sacred symbol, getting punished. These are failures of judgment, not of knowledge. They knew enough to perform powerful actions, but lacked the wisdom to know when those actions were appropriate. They possessed the explicit knowledge, the procedures, the formulas, but perhaps they lacked the tacit wisdom that would have restrained them from misapplication. The antediluvian Apkallu are never described as making mistakes. They complete plans, possess comprehensive intelligence, ascend to heaven successfully. They operate flawlessly because they were trained directly by E, because they possessed the full system, because they were not yet working from partial information and degraded transmission. The four of human descent show the cracks that appear when knowledge passes through catastrophe and emerges incomplete on the other side. Yet they remain essential. Nungal Piragoldim brought Ishtar down into her sanctuary, successful cultic operation, maintaining divine-human relationship. Lu-Nunar expelled the dragon from the temple, successful protective action, defending sacred space. Even diminished, even operating at 2/3 capacity, even making occasional errors of judgment, the human descent Apkallu continued the essential function. They bridged the gap between the antediluvian wisdom and the purely human scholarship that would follow. They were the transitional generation, inheritors of old knowledge in new circumstances, maintaining the system through its most vulnerable period. The Uruk list confirms this transition by pairing these four with post-flood kings. The institutional relationship continues. Kings still require sages. Knowledge must still inform power, but the nature of the relationship has changed because the nature of the sages has changed. They are no longer beings from the Abzu. They are humans who carry Apkallu knowledge, who bear the title and perform the function, but who operate within human limitations. The bloodline, if we can call it that, has become a text line, a training line, a transmission of knowledge through teaching and study, rather than through direct origin from divine sources. This shift from being to knowing, from ontological status to epistemological achievement, marks the moment when Mesopotamian wisdom tradition became sustainable. The antediluvian system depended on beings who came from the Abzu. When they descended back to Ea's realm, as the era Epic records, that system could have ended. But by transferring the knowledge to human carriers first, by training the four of human descent, the tradition survived the disappearance of its original embodiments. It became something humans could maintain, study, transmit, and apply without requiring the constant presence of non-human beings. The four names in the BTM Siri text are not minor additions to a list of 7. They document the most critical transition in Mesopotamian intellectual history, the moment when divine wisdom became human knowledge, when what had come from beyond became something maintainable from within, when the bloodline became a text line that would endure for 3,000 years, when the sages descended to the Abzu. The poem of Era, also called the Era Epic, survives in multiple copies from Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian sites, dating to the 9th through 7th centuries BC. The text is a theological poem exploring why the god Marduk allowed destruction to come upon Babylon, and why Era, god of plague and warfare, was given permission to devastate the land. Tablet 1 contains a passage spoken by Marduk that explains his absence from his duties. He cannot properly maintain his statue, the physical embodiment of his divine presence, because the craftsmen he requires are no longer available. Lines 147-148 state, I made those Umanu go down to the Abzu, and I said they were not to come back up. The term Umanu in this context clearly refers not to human scholars, but to the primordial Apkallu, the original craftsman who possessed complete knowledge of how to create and maintain the images of the gods. Marduk sent them down. They did not leave voluntarily. They were commanded to descend to Ea's realm, the subterranean waters, and they were explicitly forbidden to return. Lines 162-163 continue Marduk's complaint. Where are the 7 sages of the Abzu, the pure Purdu fish, who just like their lord Ea are perfect in sublime wisdom, who can make my body holy? The question is rhetorical. Marduk knows where they are, he sent them down. But the lament is real. Without the 7 Apkallu, without their perfect wisdom, Marduk cannot accomplish what he needs to accomplish. The knowledge required to properly consecrate divine images, to make the god's body holy, exists only with beings who are no longer accessible. This passage provides external testimony to the disappearance of the Apkallu. They did not gradually fade from relevance. They did not evolve into human scholars through natural succession. They were removed deliberately by divine action. The god who caused the flood, the era epic, explicitly assigns that role to Marduk. In line 132, once long ago indeed I grew angry, indeed I left my dwelling and caused the deluge, is also the god who sent the Apkallu away. The theological implications are profound. In earlier Mesopotamian tradition, Enlil was the god who decreed the flood, and Ea opposed that decision, warning humans and preserving them. But by the first millennium BC, when the era epic was composed, Marduk had absorbed many of Enlil's functions, becoming the supreme king of the pantheon. The poem presents Marduk as simultaneously the destroyer who caused the flood and the deity who now regrets the loss of the antediluvian craftsmen. He removed them after the catastrophe, perhaps as punishment for their association with Ea, perhaps because their knowledge made them dangerous, perhaps simply because the post-flood world was meant to operate under different conditions. Whatever the reason, the result was permanent absence. The Apkallu went down to the Abzu. They did not come back. And everything that depended on their knowledge, the proper maintenance of divine statues, the correct performance of certain rituals, the techniques they alone possessed, became difficult or impossible. The post-flood world had to manage with human descent Apkallu, with scholars working from texts rather than from direct divine instruction, with partial knowledge rather than complete wisdom. The era epic's placement of this event creates a chronology. Before the flood, the 7 Apkallu operated on earth, advised kings, established cities, transmitted knowledge from Ea to humanity. The flood occurred. After the flood, Marduk commanded the Apkallu to descend to the Abzu and not return. This left a gap that the 4 human descent Apkallu partially filled, but that gap was never fully closed. The transition from antediluvian perfection to post-flood approximation was forced, deliberate, irreversible. Why would Marduk do this? The poem suggests political theology. Marduk was asserting his supremacy over the pantheon, including over Ea. The Apkallu were Ea's agents, taught by Ea, loyal to Ea, embodying Ea's benevolent attitude toward humanity. By sending them to the Abzu, Marduk was limiting Ea's influence in the post-flood world. Humans would no longer have direct access to Ea's perfect wisdom through the Apkallu. They would have to work with what they could preserve, study, and reconstruct from texts. This reads as cosmic politics influencing knowledge transmission. If gods compete for supremacy, and if knowledge is power, then controlling who has access to knowledge becomes a tool of dominance. Marduk could not erase the knowledge the Apkallu had already transmitted. Texts existed, human students had been trained, institutions had been established. But he could prevent further transmission, cut the direct line, force humanity to work with archives rather than with living teachers who remembered the antediluvian world. The poem also reveals that this created problems even for the gods. Marduk himself suffers from his own decision. He needs the Apkallu's knowledge to maintain his statue, but he has sent them away and forbidden their return. The divine realm faces the same issue humanity faces: how to maintain systems that require knowledge no longer directly accessible. The solution for gods and humans alike is the same: study the old texts, follow the recorded procedures with precision, hope that fidelity to written instructions preserves enough of the original wisdom to keep the system functioning. This shared predicament between divine and human realms suggests that the Mesopotamian conception of knowledge was not idealistic. Knowledge did not exist in some eternal, perfect, purely mental realm, independent of embodiment. Knowledge was practical, embedded in practitioners, transmitted through teaching and demonstration, vulnerable to loss when its carriers died or disappeared. Even gods could lose access to knowledge if the beings who embodied it were no longer available. The seven Apkallu's descent to the Abzu closes an era. The Antediluvian world, the world of direct divine instruction, the world where Ea's sages walked among humans and perfect wisdom, was accessible through personal consultation with beings who knew completely. That world ended. The post-flood world, the world of texts and human scholars and institutional preservation and gradual degradation of transmitted knowledge, that world began. The Mesopotamians were aware they lived in the second world. They knew they no longer had access to what their ancestors had possessed. The entire structure of their intellectual culture, the reverence for ancient texts, the obsessive copying of old materials, the claims to be preserving rather than innovating, flowed from this awareness. They were not in the Golden Age. They were after it, doing their best to maintain what could be maintained, studying what the Apkallu had left behind, but knowing that the source itself was no longer reachable. The question this raises is whether the Mesopotamians were right. Not right in the literal sense that 7 fishmen from the subterranean ocean taught humans before a global flood, but right in the sense that human civilization did inherit knowledge from a previous phase, a phase that was then interrupted by catastrophe, leaving later generations working with incomplete information, reconstructing as best they could from fragmentary sources, never quite recovering the comprehensive wisdom that had once been available. If the flood metaphor represents any historical discontinuity, climate change, social collapse, the end of a previous civilization, then the story of the Apkallu's descent would be a way of recording that break. We had teachers. We had access to complete knowledge. Then something happened. The teachers left, or died, or were no longer accessible. We preserve what they taught, we study their texts, we try to maintain their systems, but we know we're working with less than what they possessed. That awareness, transmitted across generations as cultural memory, shaped how subsequent civilization understood itself and its relationship to knowledge. The era Epic preserves this awareness in theological language. Marduk sent the Apkallu down. They cannot return. We manage without them. But we also remember what was lost. The rise of the Ummanu. When the antediluvian Apkallu descended to the Abzu, and the 4 human descent sages passed into history, a new class of knowledge bearers emerged. The Akkadian term is Umnu, plural Umman. The word derives from roots, meaning craftsman, expert, master. In administrative and royal correspondence from the Neo-Assyrian period, Ummanu specifically designates the scholarly advisors attached to the royal court, physicians, exorcists, diviners, astrologers, experts in various technical disciplines who provided specialized knowledge to support the king's rule. These were not mythological figures. They were historical individuals whose names appear in letters, whose activities are documented in administrative records, whose professional relationships and family connections can be traced through archival sources. They were human beings, born and dying within normal human lifespans, trained in scribal schools, working within institutional structures. Yet they claimed direct connection to the Apkallu, presented themselves as inheritors and transmitters of the antediluvian wisdom, and were treated by kings as possessing knowledge that transcended mere human cleverness. The conceptual shift from Apkallu to Ummanu represents the complete humanization of the sage role. The Apkallu were beings from the Abzu who possessed divine knowledge by nature. The 4 human descent Apkallu were partially human, but still retained something of the supernatural origin. The Ummanu were entirely human, but they claimed access to the same knowledge tradition through textual study, institutional training, and mastery of the preserved teachings. This claim to continuity appears repeatedly in Neo-Assyrian sources. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled 669-631 BC and assembled the Great Library at Nineveh, boasted in his royal inscriptions, "I have learned the art of the Apkallu Adapa. I am familiar with the secret storehouse of all scribal learning. I can debate in an assembly of Umanu. I used to read the cleverly written compositions in which the Sumerian is obscure and the Akkadian difficult to interpret. I have studied inscriptions on stone from before the flood, which are sealed, obscure, and confused. This text, preserved on tablet L4 from Nineveh, establishes several connections. Ashurbanipal claims to have learnt the art of Adapa, the first Apkallu. He has accessed the secret storehouse, the esoteric knowledge reserved for initiates. He can hold his own in debate with the Umanu, meaning he possesses their expertise, understands their arguments, can participate in their learnt discussions. And crucially, he can read pre-flood inscriptions, texts from the Antediluvian period, written in archaic forms of language, encoded in ways that require specialized knowledge to interpret. These claims present the king as educated within the same tradition that stretched back to Adapa. The knowledge possessed by the Umanu is the knowledge the Apkallu brought. The texts studied by the king are texts written before the flood, preserved across the catastrophe, still accessible to those trained in their interpretation. The institutional continuity is explicit. Adapa, Apkallu, Umanu, king, all participating in one unbroken chain of transmission. The mechanism of this transmission was textual and pedagogical. Young scribes entered temple schools where they spent years learning the cuneiform script, memorizing sign lists, copying standard compositions. Advanced students specialized in particular fields: divination, medicine, astronomy, ritual procedure. The highest level of training involves studying the most ancient texts, the compositions attributed to Ea and the Apkallu, the materials considered foundational to all subsequent knowledge. A scribe who mastered this curriculum and achieved recognition as an expert in one or more disciplines could claim the title Umanu. This was not self-designation. It was conferred by reputation, by peer recognition, by appointment to positions where that expertise was required. Kings employed Umanu. Temples employed them. Wealthy families retained them. The title indicated professional achievement within a knowledge tradition understood to originate with divine revelation. The Umanu did not merely possess information, they possessed interpretation. Many of the antediluvian texts were deliberately obscure, written in archaic language, using obsolete grammatical forms, encoded in ways that required commentary to explicate. The Umanu functioned as interpreters, explaining what the old texts meant, how to apply their principles to current situations, how to perform the procedures they described. This interpretive role gave them power. They controlled access to the meaning of authoritative sources. Simo Parpola's analysis of Neo-Assyrian scholarly correspondence reveals how this worked in practice. The Umanu formed what he calls a scholarly mafia, a small, interconnected group of families who monopolized the highest advisory positions across multiple generations. Sons followed fathers into specialized disciplines. Knowledge passed through family lines. Marriage alliances connected major scholarly houses. The result was an intellectual aristocracy, hereditary experts who claimed their positions both through institutional training and through family inheritance of knowledge. This system created stability but also insularity. The same names appear repeatedly in the correspondence. The same families advise successive kings. Innovation is rare. The focus is on correct interpretation of traditional sources, not on developing new theories or challenging inherited wisdom. The Umanu saw themselves as preservers, not discoverers. Their role was to maintain the tradition, connecting them back to the Apkallu, not to advance beyond it. Yet they were not mere copiers. The letters showed genuine intellectual activity, debate over interpretations, disagreement about how to read particular omens, competing explanations of celestial phenomena. The tradition was living, actively engaged with current problems, applying old knowledge to new circumstances, but the framework remained conservative. The answers were believed to exist already in the Antediluvian texts. The Umanu's job was to find those answers, understand them correctly, and apply them appropriately. King Esarhaddon's correspondence with his Umanu provides detailed examples. Letters discuss medical diagnosis, treatments for royal ailments, interpretations of dreams, readings of celestial omens, appropriate timing for military campaigns based on divinatory signs. The Umanu provide expert opinion, cite relevant texts, argue for specific interpretations. The king considers their advice, sometimes requests second opinions, ultimately makes decisions informed by their expertise. This represents institutionalized access to the knowledge tradition. The king does not personally study all the antediluvian texts. He employs experts who have done that study. Those experts channel the old knowledge into current policy. The system established in the antediluvian world, kings advised by Apkallu, continues in modified form. The advisors are now human scholars rather than beings from the Abzu, but the function remains constant. The transition from Apkallu to Umanu thus represents not the loss of a knowledge tradition, but its successful adaptation to post-catastrophe conditions. The direct divine connection was broken, but the texts survived. Institutions developed to study those texts, train new generations in their interpretation, and maintain their application to ongoing social and political needs. The wisdom of Ea, transmitted through the Apkallu, became the curriculum of scribal schools, the professional expertise of the Umanu, and the cultural foundation of Mesopotamian civilization for 3 millennia. Secrets buried in Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 290 BC, served as priest of Marduk in Babylon. His work, Babyloniaca, consisted of 3 books covering Mesopotamian history from creation through the Seleucid period. The original text is lost, but fragments survive in quotations by later historians, Josephus Flavius, Eusebius of Caesarea, and others who found Berossus useful for reconciling Greek chronology with Near Eastern traditions. Book 1 of the Babyloniaca described Oannes, the fish being who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach humanity the foundations of civilization. Oannes is identified by scholars with Yuana, the first Apkallu, and with Adapa from the Akkadian myths. Berossus states that Oannes gave humans knowledge of letters and sciences and crafts of all types, taught the founding of cities, the establishment of temples, the introduction of laws and land measurement, and showed them seeds and the gathering of fruits. The account concludes, from that time, nothing further has been discovered. That final phrase is crucial. Berossus claims that all subsequent knowledge was elaboration, application, commentary on what Oannes initially taught. Nothing fundamentally new was discovered after the antediluvian revelation. This aligns perfectly with the Mesopotamian self-understanding we've traced through other sources. Knowledge came from primordial teaching, not from human innovation. But Berossus adds a detail not preserved in cuneiform sources. All writings were preserved by being buried in Sippar. Before the flood, texts containing the revealed knowledge were buried at Sippar, the city of the sun god Shamash, one of the 5 antediluvian cities listed in the Sumerian king list. These buried texts survived the flood. After the waters receded, the survivors retrieved the archives from Sippar and used them to restore civilization. Sippar's archaeological site, Tel Abu Habar, was excavated extensively in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The city contained major temples, administrative buildings, and substantial archives of cuneiform tablets. Many tablets recovered from Sippar date to the Old Babylonian period and later, showing the city remained an important centre of learning. Whether any antediluvian archives survived there is impossible to determine archaeologically. Tablets from that early would likely be unrecognisable if they existed, but Berosus's claim reflects a Mesopotamian tradition about deliberate preservation of pre-catastrophe knowledge. The concept of burying texts for preservation appears in other contexts. Foundation deposits in temples often included tablets documenting the building's construction, dedicatory inscriptions, sometimes copies of important historical or religious texts. These were placed in the walls, under corners, in foundation trenches, locations where they would be protected from damage and where future generations might recover them during renovation or rebuilding. The practice served both ritual and archival functions, connecting the building to its history and ensuring certain information survived. If antediluvian scholars knew catastrophe was coming, if Ear's warning to Ziusudra Atrahasis Utnapishtim was not isolated but part of broader preparation, then burying the most important texts would be logical preservation strategy. Clay tablets are durable but not indestructible. Flooding can dissolve unfired clay, disperse tablets, destroy libraries. But tablets buried in sealed deposits, especially if placed in ceramic containers, could survive immersion and subsequent excavation. Berosus's specification of Sippar is interesting. Not Eridu, the first city, Ear's city, where we might expect the archives to be kept. Not Babylon, Marduk's city, the centre of later Mesopotamian culture. But Sippar, the city of Shamash, the sun god associated with justice, law, and revelation. The catalogue of texts and authors attributes certain divinatory texts to Enki, king of Sippar, who was taken to heaven by Shamash and Adad and taught the secrets of divination. Sippar thus had specific connection to divine revelation and transmission of knowledge from heaven to earth. Whether any physical antediluvian archive existed at Sippar, the tradition served important functions. It explained how post-flood civilization recovered so quickly, not by gradual redevelopment from primitive conditions, but by accessing preserved knowledge, retrieving the instruction manuals, consulting the texts the Apkallu had written. It located the source of authority in a specific, geographically real place. Scholars could theoretically go to Sippar, excavate carefully, find the buried tablets if they survived. It made the connection between antediluvian and post-flood knowledge concrete, material, textual rather than mystical or purely oral. This textual emphasis is consistent across Mesopotamian sources. The Apkallu did not merely teach by demonstration or oral instruction, they wrote. Adapa wrote down at Ear's dictation the foundational texts. The knowledge was preserved in writing. Writing survived the flood. Post-flood scholars read what the Apkallu wrote, studied it, copied it, transmitted it. The chain of transmission was explicitly textual. This has profound implications for understanding Mesopotamian intellectual culture. They were not a purely oral tradition society. They valued writing as preservation technology, as knowledge storage, as the mechanism by which wisdom could transcend the mortality of individual teachers. The Umanu did not claim to channel the Apkallu mystically or to access their knowledge through spiritual revelation. They claimed to read their texts, to study their writings, to have preserved libraries containing materials traceable to antediluvian composition. The buried archives of Sippar, whether historical fact or legitimating myth, represent this textual ideology. Knowledge inscribed in durable media, deliberately protected, recoverable after catastrophe, readable across millennia. This was the Mesopotamian theory of cultural continuity. Civilization could survive destruction if its knowledge survived. And knowledge survived if it was properly written, properly stored, properly retrieved by those who knew where to look and how to read. Modern archaeology has not recovered antediluvian tablets. No cuneiform text has been definitively dated to the pre-flood period as the Mesopotamians understood it. But this proves nothing about their belief. They believed the Sippar archives existed. They structured their intellectual institutions around that belief. They trained generations of scholars to study what they understood to be recovered antediluvian texts, and they maintained that system for 3,000 years of documented history. Whether the bloodline of knowledge they claimed was historical or mythological, they treated it as real, as accessible, as the foundation upon which everything else rested. The secrets buried in Sippar, retrieved after the flood, studied by the Umanu, applied by kings, this was how civilization remembered its origins and understood its continuing relationship to wisdom that came from before the catastrophe. The Umanu as royal mafia. The letters collected in Simo Parpola's edition of Neo-Assyrian correspondence reveal the inner workings of the Umanu system at its height. During the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, a small group of approximately 16 scholars formed the inner circle of royal advisors. These were the men the king consulted regularly, whose expertise shaped policy decisions, who transmitted reports on celestial phenomena, medical conditions, ritual requirements, and divinatory interpretations. The letters show these Umanu were not independent intellectuals offering advice from a position of scholarly detachment. They were embedded in court politics, competing for royal favour, sometimes disagreeing with each other's interpretations, defending their reputations, maintaining their families' positions. Parpola describes this as a scholarly mafia, professional knowledge holders who monopolised access to expertise through family networks, hereditary transmission of specialised knowledge, and strategic control of institutional positions. Several prominent families appear repeatedly across the correspondence. The descendants of Gabu Ilani Iresh served as chief exorcists across multiple generations. The family of Nabu Zukub Kenu produced prominent diviners. The house of Balassi controlled certain medical and astronomical positions. Sons trained under fathers, inheriting not just knowledge, but professional networks, client relationships, and access to royal attention. This hereditary pattern made sense given how knowledge transmission actually worked. A physician's son would grow up surrounded by medical texts, observing treatments, learning diagnosis through apprenticeship long before formal scribal training began. An astrologer's son would be taken to observe celestial phenomena, taught to recognize planetary positions, trained in the interpretation of the Omen series, Enma Anu Enlil, through years of direct instruction. By the time these sons entered the scribal academy, they already possessed tacit knowledge that pure textual study could not provide. The Umanu guarded this knowledge carefully. The phrase piritu, secret, appears frequently in colophons of scholarly texts. Certain compositions were marked for the initiate only, not to be shown to outsiders, to be kept within the professional guild. This secrecy served multiple functions. It maintained the Umanu's monopoly on expertise, preventing non-specialists from claiming knowledge they had not properly acquired. It protected the prestige of the profession by making access difficult, and it reflected genuine belief that certain knowledge was dangerous if possessed by the unqualified. Beat Pongratz Leisten's concept of Herrschaftswissen, knowledge of dominance, captures how this functioned politically. The Umanu possessed knowledge essential to effective rule. They could interpret omens predicting the outcome of military campaigns. They could read celestial signs indicating divine favour or anger. They could diagnose royal illnesses and prescribe treatments. They could determine auspicious timing for important state rituals. This expertise gave them power, made them indispensable, ensured their families' positions across generations. Kings could not rule effectively without the Umanu, but the Umanu depended on kings for patronage, protection, and resources. The relationship was symbiotic. Royal inscriptions boast of the king's learning, his ability to read the antediluvian texts, his mastery of the Apkallu's wisdom. These claims enhanced royal legitimacy by presenting the king as educated within the same tradition that stretched back to Adapa. The Umanu benefited by serving a king who valued their expertise, who invested in libraries, who supported the scribal schools where future Umanu were trained. The letters reveal tensions within this system. Umanu sometimes disagreed about interpretations, forcing the king to adjudicate between competing expert opinions. Scholars occasionally fell from royal favour, losing their positions to rivals. Some letters show anxiety about reputation, defensiveness about criticism, concern that other Umanu were undermining their standing. The system was stable across generations, but not without internal competition and conflict. What prevented this from becoming purely corrupt, purely about political power, divorced from genuine expertise, was the grounding in the textual tradition. The Umanu could not simply invent interpretations. They had to cite authoritative texts, demonstrate that their readings followed correct hermeneutical procedures, show that their conclusions aligned with the preserved corpus of antediluvian wisdom. Their power derived from claimed access to that wisdom, and the claim was only sustainable if their actual expertise met professional standards maintained by the guild. This creates an interesting comparison to modern academic guilds. University professors also form hereditary intellectual networks, also guard specialised knowledge through professional credentialing, also compete for resources while maintaining collective standards. The Umanu system was an early version of institutionalised expertise, complete with training requirements, professional ethics, peer review of interpretations, and sanctions against those who violated guild norms. The Assyrian Royal Library at Nineveh, excavated in the 19th century and now distributed among the British Museum and other collections, preserves the materials the Umanu studied. Thousands of tablets covering divination, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, ritual, mythology, history. Many tablets include colophons identifying them as copies made for Ashurbanipal's library, often noting they were copied from ancient tablets, from originals in Babylon or Psippar, sometimes claiming the source was an antediluvian text. This library represents the physical infrastructure of the Umanu system. To maintain expertise across generations, you need preserved texts, institutional support for copying and studying those texts, training programs that transmit both explicit and tacit knowledge, and patronage ensuring the system's economic sustainability. Ashurbanipal provided that infrastructure, and in return, his Umanu provided the expertise that supported his rule. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed in 612 BC, the Umanu system did not disappear. It relocated to Babylon, adapted to new political conditions, continued under Persian rule, persisted into the Hellenistic period. The last dated cuneiform tablets come from the 1st century AD, showing the tradition survived in some form for 7 centuries after Assyrian collapse. The knowledge attributed to the Apkallu, transmitted through the Umanu, proved more durable than any individual empire. The scholarly mafia, for all its political entanglements and hereditary monopolies, successfully preserved and transmitted a knowledge tradition across centuries of political instability, foreign conquest, and cultural change. They maintained the institutional connection to the antediluvian past, kept the Apkallu's texts readable and relevant, and ensured that the wisdom Ea had revealed through Adapa remained accessible to those trained to access it. Bloodline or text line. The evidence assembled across cuneiform sources preserves 2 competing models of how Apkallu knowledge was transmitted to post-flood humanity. The first emphasizes biological descent, the 4 Apkallu of human descent, Lunana being 2/3 Apkallu, the hereditary Umanu families passing expertise from father to son. The second emphasizes textual transmission, Adapa writing at Ea's dictation, archives buried in Sippar, scholarly study of preserved tablets. The sources do not resolve this tension. They maintain both models simultaneously, suggesting the Mesopotamians themselves understood transmission operating through multiple channels. The biological model appears in the BT Masiri's distinction between the 7 antediluvian Apkallu and the 4 post-flood sages explicitly called seed of mankind. This language of seed and descent implies inheritance, reproduction, the passing of Apkallu nature through generation. Lu Nana's fraction, 2/3 Apkallu, suggests measurable degrees of this inheritance, as if Apkallu status could be quantified, as if it existed in the blood at calculable proportions. If taken literally, this would imply the Apkallu mated with humans, producing hybrid offspring who inherited partial Apkallu nature. This interpretation aligns with traditions in other cultures. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch, who descended and produced hybrid children, the Greek gods producing demigod heroes, widespread mythologies of divine-human mixing producing beings of intermediate status. The 4 human descent, Apkallu, would then be literal descendants of the original 7, carrying genetic inheritance of supernatural capability. But the texts never explicitly state that the Apkallu reproduced with humans. The phrase seed of mankind could mean simply born from human parents, as opposed to emerged from the Abzu. The 4 would then be fully human in biological origin, but recipients of Apkallu knowledge through training. Their partial status would reflect incomplete learning, not genetic dilution. The textual model dominates the scholarly attributions. The catalogue of texts and authors attributes foundational works to Ea through Adappa's writing. Medical texts include colophons stating they are PE of the mouth of E, preserved across centuries through copying. The whole structure of Mesopotamian scribal education assumed that knowledge existed in texts, that those texts were old, that studying them gave access to the wisdom their original authors possessed. This model requires no supernatural biology. Adappa learned from E. Adappa wrote down what he learned. Those writings were preserved. The 4 human descent Apkallu studied those writings, mastered them, and transmitted that mastery to their students. The Umanu continued this process, generation after generation, accessing the same antediluvian corpus, interpreting it, applying it, maintaining it through institutional study rather than through bloodline. The advantage of the textual model is sustainability. Biological inheritance is vulnerable. If the hybrid line dies out, the knowledge dies with it. But texts can be copied infinitely, studied by anyone with proper training, transmitted across unrelated lineages. The Umanu families may have been hereditary, but their knowledge was not biologically dependent. An outsider with sufficient talent and training could master the same texts, achieve the same expertise, claim the same connection to the Apkallu tradition. Yet the sources maintain both models. The Uruk list pairs kings with Apkallu, suggesting institutional positions, but also implies continuity across the flood, as if the sage role was transmitted somehow. The palace reliefs depict Apkallu in fish form, emphasizing their non-human origin, while also showing fully human figures in the same protective positions, suggesting functional equivalence between supernatural and human sage types. Perhaps the resolution is that the Mesopotamians distinguished between 2 different questions: where did the knowledge come from, and how was it transmitted afterward? The knowledge came from the Abzu, from Ea, through beings who were not human. That origin was supernatural, unrepeatable, located in the antediluvian past. But the transmission was textual and pedagogical, operating through human institutions, sustainable across normal historical time. The bloodline would then be metaphorical or institutional rather than biological. The Umanu were descendants of the Apkallu in the sense that they inherited the Apkallu's role, studied the Apkallu's texts, performed the Apkallu's functions. They were not genetically related, but institutionally related, connected through a chain of teaching and learning that trace back, link by link, to the first sage who learned from E. This interpretation explains the coexistence of both models. The Mesopotamians needed to maintain the supernatural origin to preserve the authority of their knowledge. It came from the gods, not from human invention. But they also needed a practical transmission mechanism that could survive across centuries, texts and training, institutions and schools, positions that could be filled by qualified humans without requiring supernatural breeding. The result was a knowledge tradition that claimed divine origin while operating through human institutions, that revered antediluvian sages while training contemporary scholars, that looked backward to primordial revelation while maintaining forward-moving transmission through each new generation. The bloodline and the text line merged into a single system where biological metaphors described institutional realities, where claims of descent meant not genetics but pedagogy, where being seed of the Apkallu meant having mastered their teachings and having been accepted into the professional guild that maintained those teachings. Whether the 7 original Apkallu were historical individuals, mythological creations, or cultural memories of a prior civilization's knowledge bearers, the system built around their legacy functioned effectively for 3 millennia. It preserved astronomical observations, medical knowledge, mathematical techniques, ritual procedures, literary compositions, and historical records across empires' rise and fall through foreign conquests and cultural transformations. That preservation was the true bloodline, not genetic but intellectual, not biological inheritance but institutional transmission, not blood passed through bodies but knowledge passed through texts, teachers, and the students who became the next generation's teachers. The Mesopotamians may have used the language of bloodline because that was their available metaphor for lasting connection, for inheritance that transcended individual mortality, for identity that persisted across generations. But what they actually built was something more robust than biology, a knowledge tradition sustainable through study, transmissible through teaching, independent of any one person's life or death, and maintainable as long as someone valued it enough to learn, practice, and pass it forward. The quiet current. The tablet W2307 remains in Baghdad. The clay is still pale ochre. The cuneiform signs still cast tiny shadows when light catches them properly. The 2 columns, kings on the left, sages on the right, still document a system that operated before the flood and reconstituted itself after, that broke and then repaired, that lost direct divine connection but maintained institutional memory. In the quiet hours, when the museum is closed and the tablet rests in its archival box, the question it poses does not change. Were the Sumerians documenting or inventing, recording or mythologizing, preserving memory of something real that was then interrupted, or creating explanatory narratives to account for their own mysterious sophistication? Perhaps the question is less important than what they built around their answer. They believed they had inherited wisdom from before catastrophe. That belief structured their entire intellectual culture. They created schools to study ancient texts. They trained generations of scholars to master complex disciplines. They maintained libraries across centuries. They developed hermeneutical techniques for interpreting obscure passages. They created professional guilds to guard and transmit expertise. They embedded knowledge bearers in centres of power, ensuring that wisdom informed governance. All of this was sustainable, practical, functional, regardless of whether the 7 Apkallu were historical figures or mythological constructs. The tradition worked. The knowledge preserved was genuine knowledge, astronomical observations, accurate enough to track planetary cycles, medical treatments effective enough to heal actual diseases, mathematical techniques sophisticated enough to solve practical problems, architectural principles sound enough to create, structures that stood for millennia. The bloodline they claimed, whether biological or institutional, genetic or pedagogical, created continuity across time. Students felt connected to teachers separated by centuries. Umanu in the 7th century BC believed they studied the same texts as Adapa in the antediluvian world. That belief in continuity generated obligation to preserve accurately, to transmit faithfully, to maintain the chain unbroken. Western scholarship since the 19th century has classified Mesopotamian claims about antediluvian knowledge as mythology pure invention to explain the origin of culture. But that classification may reveal more about Western assumptions than about Mesopotamian reality. We assume knowledge develops gradually, emerges from human experimentation, accumulates through individual innovation. We struggle with claims that it came ready-made, transmitted from beyond, inherited rather than invented. Yet human history contains genuine discontinuities. Civilizations do collapse, libraries do burn, knowledge systems are lost. What survives to the other side depends on what was preserved, by whom, under what circumstances. If an earlier phase of civilization reached high sophistication, then collapsed, then survivors rebuilt using whatever they could recover, that scenario fits archaeological evidence from multiple sites and periods. The Mesopotamian testimony would then document that rebuilding process from the inside. They inherited texts they could barely read. They preserved techniques they could barely perform. They maintained traditions they could not fully explain. So they told the story that made sense of their situation. These texts came from before the catastrophe, written by sages taught by gods, preserved through deliberate archival procedures, recovered by our ancestors, transmitted to us. We study them, we maintain them, we honour the source, even though the source no longer speaks to us directly. That story sustained the longest running knowledge tradition in recorded human history. From the Uruk period around 3400 BC through the final cuneiform tablets in the 1st century AD, roughly 3400 years of continuous scribal practice, institutional scholarship, textual transmission. The tradition claimed connection to earlier sources, to pre-flood wisdom, to the Apkallu, who brought knowledge from the Abzu. That claim, true or false, generated the cultural infrastructure that preserved Mesopotamian learning across 3.5 millennia. The quiet current moves through time. What the Apkallu knew, the Umanu studied. What the Umanu preserved, modern scholars translate. What modern scholars translate you hear now, in the darkness, in the quiet hours, as the old names Yuana, Adapa, and Meduga move through sound and reach you wherever you are in the world. The Sumerians believed knowledge moves through channels, through specific transmissions, through teaching and learning, and the patient work of copying text by hand onto durable media. They were right about that. Whether or not they were right about fishmen from the Abzu, knowledge does not exist as abstract truth hovering nowhere. It exists in minds that learn it, in texts that preserve it, in institutions that teach it, in practices that embody it. The bloodline of the Apkallu, if it existed, was this: the choice to preserve rather than abandon, to study rather than forget, to transmit rather than let die. That choice, made by each generation, maintained across centuries, sustained through political collapse and cultural change, created continuity more lasting than stone, more durable than empire, more persistent than any bloodline traced through bodies. If you value knowledge, if something in you responds to careful study, to preserved wisdom, to transmitted understanding, then you participate in that same choice. The Apkallu are gone. The antediluvian world is lost. The texts are fragmentary, but the impulse to preserve, to study, to understand, to transmit, that remains. The quiet current continues. Rest well, knowing that what matters most in human civilization is not what we invent but what we remember, not what we create from nothing but what we preserve from the past, not innovation but transmission, not origin but continuation. The Apkallu understood that. The Umanu maintained it. The Sumerians documented it. And you, listening in the quiet hours, receive it. The bloodline revealed in the records is simply this: knowledge passes from teacher to student, from writer to reader, from voice to ear, across time, across catastrophe, across the distance between what was lost and what remains. That passage requires no supernatural origin, no fishmen from subterranean oceans, no divine dictation. It requires only what the Mesopotamians gave it: patience, reverence, precision, and the conviction that what came before matters enough to preserve for what comes after. Sleep now. The current flows. The transmission continues. And somewhere, always, someone is learning what the sages taught.